Boom, you just pirated, bought Adobe Photoshop, and you're like, whoa, what are all these buttons here? So confusing. How do I edit a photo? I've been using Photoshop for more than 10 years, and in this video, I'm going to try to recreate one of my latest video thumbnails in Photoshop, which will be a great way for someone who's a beginner to learn how to use it. But first, let's work on this potato image. I'm going to right-click, save this image on my desktop, potato PNG. And once I'm inside of Photoshop, I can come to my desktop and drag this potato image in, which will import it inside. Now, the reason we're doing the potato first is so that we can get familiar with the basic features and all the tools before we jump in and start recreating that thumbnail. So first things first, this potato is massive, so I want to zoom out. For that, I'm going to hold Alt on my keyboard, Option on Mac, and scroll on my mouse, which will zoom out. Beautiful. Now you'll see a bunch of panels on the left, at the top, and on the right side of Photoshop. So let's go over each one of them. On the left, you can see your tools panel. At the top, you can see all of these menus, which are useful. And below these menus, you can see options for the tool that you have selected. So if I select the brush tool, these options change. On the right, there are a bunch of panels. Probably the most important one is the layers panel. This is where you'll be able to see your layers. I can click this button here to add a new layer. And if I paint on the potato, this beautiful painting is on top of it. But if I move this layer below the potato, now the potato is covering it. So that's how layers work. At the top, there's properties, which you don't need to worry about right now. Adjustments that let you add, well, adjustments to your image. For example, if I want to make this potato black and white, I'm going to click on black and white, and it inserted a new black and white layer that makes everything under it black and white. So now the potato is black and white, and my painting that was already black also became black. Now here what I did is clicked on this eye here next to the layer, which made that layer invisible. If I click this eye on my painting, it becomes invisible. Same for the potato. Now you'll also notice that there's this checkered background in the background, which means that there's nothing here. If I were to export this image from Photoshop and choose PNG as the format, you'll see that when I open this image, it doesn't have a background. It's a potato with the painting. So this checkered board basically means that there's nothing there. Now you'll notice that when the layer is selected, so when I click on it with my mouse, these properties change. This now shows the properties of this black and white layer that I can tweak around. Now the reason nothing is happening to the potato as I'm moving this is because this layer isn't visible. This eye isn't clicked. When I click it and move this slider, stuff is happening. Now it looks like a weird moon. Okay, to delete a layer, you can drag it into this trash icon or simply click delete and it's deleted. I'm also going to delete my beautiful painting. So that's the layers panel. Now some more things that you can do inside of the layers panel is change how visible a certain layer is by changing the opacity. So if I click here and drag this or hover over opacity with my mouse and drag left, you'll notice that the potato starts vanishing. Fill is very similar to opacity, at least for this potato, but what fill does is, for example, if you add like a stroke to this potato, then fill will only make the potato invisible, but not the outline. And opacity will make everything invisible. That's the difference. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. One more thing you can do is click this lock icon, which will lock the layer, which means that now I can't pick it up and move it anywhere. It becomes an immune potato. If I unlock it, now if I click with my mouse, I can move it around. Cool. Now let's go over some of the tools. The first tool is called the move tool, and that's what it does. It moves stuff when you pick it up. Now you'll notice that some tools have this little triangle next to them. That means that there are more tools hidden underneath, and you can access those tools by holding Alt or Option on Mac and clicking on the tool, and it cycles between them. This is the artboard tool that we don't need to worry about right now, but you'll also notice that when you hover over a tool, this panel pops up and it tells you the shortcut with which you can access this tool. So for example, if I've been using my brush tool on the potato and I want to quickly switch to the move tool, I don't have to use my mouse to come over here and click on the tool to select it. I can do it with my keyboard. So B for the brush tool and V for the move tool. I highly recommend learning these keyboard shortcuts, and especially the ones that you're going to be using a lot, like the lasso tool, the crop tool, or the brush tool, is definitely worth learning the keyboard shortcuts for. The next tool is this circle tool, or this tool. Remember, I'm switching them by holding Alt and clicking on the tool, or this rectangle or the circle. And these let you select stuff. So if I drag with this rectangle, it now selected this area. Now if I pick my brush tool and want to paint somewhere, it's only going to paint in the selected area. Now you'll notice that I can also pick up the selection and move it around. So if I want to move it here and then switch back to my brush tool and paint in this corner, I can do that as well. One more thing, when I switch back to my move tool by holding V, the selection doesn't disappear. To make it disappear, you have to deselect. You deselect with Control D on your keyboard or Command D if you're on macOS. I'm going to undo that with Control Z or Command Z, and the same way I was able to move the selection when I had this tool selected, it only moved the selection. When I have my move tool selected, it will move everything that's selected on the current layer. So now if I move it, look at what happens to the potato. There's a rectangle cut out of it. Okay, I'm going to undo a bunch of stuff and add a new layer on top of the potato, then select a different color down here, for example, red, paint something, and then draw a rectangle once again. I can move the selection normally if I have this tool selected, but if I switch to my move tool, now I'll be able to move what's selected. So this thing here. Now it didn't move the potato because I had this top layer selected with my mouse. If I now select the potato, this rectangle will move the potato. So it's very important to remember which layer you have selected. I don't need this one anymore, so I'm going to drag it into the trash to delete it. Moving on, this is the lasso tool. You can access it with the letter L on your keyboard, and it's essentially the same as this selection tool, but it lets you select freely. So if I want to draw a shape like this and then move it out of the potato, I can do that. It essentially lets you select whatever shape that you want. There are more tools hidden underneath. I'm going to click Alt and click on them to see what they do. This one, instead of selecting smoothly, selects in corners like this. So I can make a shape that has straight lines and sharp corners. Next one is the magnetic lasso tool. Photoshop tells us here that it makes selections that snap to edges of objects. So if I want to select the edge of this potato, it automatically tries to guess where the edge is and select this object. That's pretty cool. And once I come here, I can click and it makes the selection of the potato. Now, one easier way that you can select an object that's on your layer is by coming to your layer, holding Control or Command on Mac. You can see that my hand turned into a select icon. And if I click on the image of the layer, it will select all the visible pixels of that layer. So now it selected the potato. Cool. Next, we have this tool, which is the object selection tool. This one essentially lets you click on an object and Photoshop analyzes it with its AI and selects it for you. This one's pretty useful. This is the crop tool. You can bring it up with the letter C and it lets you crop your image. Here at the top, I can choose the aspect ratio. I'll do 16:9, and if I drag the corners, I'll make my canvas bigger. Or alternatively, instead of making the canvas bigger, I can select the potato, make sure the layer is selected, and click Control T on my keyboard or Command T on macOS. This will let me transform the layer, which means that you can resize it like this, or if you hold Shift, it's going to resize unproportionally. So I can now definitely turn this into the moon. You're going to be using transform for quite a bit, so I highly recommend learning the Control or Command T keyboard shortcut. We're going to skip a few tools. This is the color picker or the eyedropper tool. It essentially lets you pick a color. So if I click here on the potato, you'll notice that down here, my main color changed. If I want to change this color again, I can double click and either pick somewhere with my color picker or do this manually and pick a different color that I want. Ooh, there's a little trick here. If you have the brush tool selected, the keyboard shortcut is B, and you press down and hold the Alt key or Option on Mac, you'll be able to temporarily enable the color picker, and once you release your mouse and the Alt key, it will switch back to the brush tool. So you can paint with one color, pick another color, and then quickly paint with another one. This maneuver also works with other tools. For example, if I have my move tool selected and I want to temporarily paint something with the brush tool, I can hold down B, which is the keyboard shortcut for the brush tool, paint something, and once I release the letter B on my keyboard, it will switch back to the move tool. So just saves time. Or if I want to quickly select something, I can hold L for the lasso tool, select something, then release L, and it will switch back to my move tool. Very nice. Next, we have this group of tools. First one is the spot healing brush tool, and the keyboard shortcut for it is J. So what this does, well, I should probably not be showing this on a potato, but if you pick this tool, you can essentially mask or get rid of imperfect spots. For example, if you want to remove something from your skin in a photo, let's say I want to remove this thing, I'm going to make my brush slightly bigger. Oh, the way you can make your brush size bigger or smaller is by hitting the bracket keys on your keyboard. The right bracket will increase it and the left bracket decrease it. Or the way I like to do it, on Windows, you hold down the Alt key and then drag right or left after pressing the right mouse button, the one that right clicks. And if you drag right, it will increase your brush, and left, it will decrease it. Now, if you drag up, it will decrease the hardness of your brush, and if you drag down, it will increase the hardness of your brush. This is a hard brush and this is a soft brush. So a hard one has hard edges and this one has soft edges. Beautiful. Let's press J to come back to this tool, and essentially I can paint over this thing and it disappears. I'm going to make my brush soft for this so it fades nicely with the background. Paint again, disappears. Before, after, and I can do this all over the potato and it gets rid of these spots, makes the potato look more even. Now, one problem here is that I've done this on this potato layer, which means that it destroyed the original layer. Now, if I carry on editing this picture and make more stuff, but then I change my mind and want to get all of those spots back, I can't. Well, now I can undo this with Control Z and it will undo what I did. But if I do a bunch more stuff, it will undo that stuff as well. So a good practice is to always do stuff like this on a new layer. If I add an empty layer and go back to my spot healing brush tool, now I can get rid of these spots. And once I'm done, they're now on this new layer. I can hide this layer, which will reveal all these spots, or I can hide the potato layer to see what's on top here. One more thing that I might want to do is say that I don't want to get rid of these spots 100%. So I can decrease the opacity of this top layer, which will slightly reveal all the spots that were underneath on the potato. So now before, after, before, after. So this top layer is now not visible by 100%, and so it doesn't hide all of those spots perfectly. And the good news now is if I make a bunch more edits, I can just go back and disable this to reveal all of those spots. So doing stuff on separate layers makes it so you can go back and change your mind. Next, we have the brush tool, pretty self-explanatory. Then the clone stamp tool. This one clones stuff. For example, if I wanted to duplicate this thing here and put it over here, I can take my clone stamp tool, then hold Alt or Option on Mac and click on the spot that I want to replicate. Then I'm going to increase my brush size and you'll notice that it's picking from this spot and it's going to replicate somewhere else. So if I click here, it just replicated that spot over here. Now, if I were to make my brush super hard, it would have replicated that spot with hard edges. So you can see that it's not blending in. But if my brush is smooth like this, then whatever I'm replicating is going to fit in nicely. What I can also do is click and drag and it will continue to replicate the area, but not the same area, the area where the plus is. So you can see that the plus moves around as I move the brush. This tool is also pretty powerful. This is the eraser tool, just erases stuff, but doing this is also destructive. I can't get this erased area back later. So we'll talk about how to do erasing non-destructively later. Next, we have the gradient tool, which essentially lets you drag and add a gradient to your image. A gradient is essentially two or more colors changing smoothly between each other. I can make the shape of this potato a gradient. We'll talk about that later. This is the smudge tool that smudges things. Very intensive on your computer. Now I have to wait while it finishes. Any second now. And Photoshop seems to have crashed. Let's quickly end task and reopen it again. One very useful thing that Photoshop does is it automatically recovers what was lost. So you can see that the name of this file is potatorecovered.png. So it tried its best to recover what I have done, even though I haven't saved this file anywhere. Speaking of saving, let's do that now. I can click Command or Control S to save this file, and I'm going to name it potato. You'll notice that it has the PSD extension, and this is a file that Photoshop understands. So once I close Photoshop and open a PSD file, it will have all the layers and all the stuff that I did to the photo within this file. Back to the smudge tool, if I make it slightly smaller, it will let me smudge things. I don't use this tool a lot. Next is the dodge tool, which also has the burn tool, this hand here. And essentially dodging areas makes them brighter and burning areas makes them darker. But this is again destructive. I can't recover this later, and there are much better ways to do dodging and burning in such a way that doesn't destroy the image. Next is the pen tool. This is going to be your arch nemesis once you start using Photoshop, but once you get used to how to use it, it's going to become one of your most used tools. Next is the text tool that lets you create and write text. Very interesting. This is related to the pen tool and it lets you play around with the handles that you have created with the pen tool. Oh, and this thing that you create with the pen tool is called a path. You can turn a path into a selection by clicking Control and Enter, and it's now just a regular selection, or you can use it for more cool stuff that I'll probably mention later. Then we have some shape tools, so the rectangle, circle, the Illuminati tool. These tools let you create custom shapes like this. And you can click on the shape, go into the properties panel and adjust its fill color, the stroke color and stroke thickness, and many different things. It's for creating shapes. Now these two tools, the hand tool and the zoom tool, are pretty useful, but I never switch to them by coming here. I use keyboard shortcuts. So in Photoshop, if you hold down space, you can drag and move your canvas with this hand. For the zoom tool, you can hold down the letter Z and drag left with your first mouse button to zoom out and drag right to zoom in. So if I want to zoom into a specific spot, maybe over here, I'm going to come here with my mouse, hold Z and scroll right. Then I can do some things here. And if I want to zoom out so that my canvas fits my screen, I can click Control or Command 0. This will reset the zoom amount. So whenever you're zoomed out and maybe your canvas is over there and you don't want to use the zoom tool to zoom back in, you can simply click Control 0 and it will reset it. Cool. So we've briefly gone over some of the tools. Now let's close this potato image and start working on the thumbnail. So first I'm going to go into File, New. Here I already have a thumbnail preset, but I'm going to create a new one because you won't have this preset. So I want the width of my thumbnail to be 1280 and the height 720 pixels. Here I don't need to worry about anything else, and I'm going to click Create. And boom, we have an empty canvas. Now you'll notice that every new Photoshop file starts with a background that is also locked. What I usually do is click on the lock icon to unlock it so I can delete it. Or actually, I can't delete it because it's the only layer here. So if I add a new layer and then delete the white background, I will be left with the checkered board with essentially nothing. I'm also going to open the thumbnail so I can see what I did and try to replicate it. First things first, Photoshop files open like tabs in your browser and you can switch between them over here. So this is my canvas and this is my thumbnail that I'm going to try to recreate. We're going to need a background. There are a couple ways to add the background. I can use the fill bucket tool that's underneath the gradient tool and fill my canvas with a color. I can use a big brush tool and paint it in. But the way I like to do it is by coming here, clicking on this round icon and selecting solid color. This is essentially the same as the adjustment panel over here. You can add a bunch of different adjustments into your layers panel. So solid color will fill the background with a solid color. Now I don't want to guess which color I need to pick. So for now I'm going to click OK, then go back into my thumbnail, select the brush tool, hold Alt in order to pick the color. And now you'll notice that my foreground color became the color that I picked. Now if I go back, this color doesn't change and I can come here to my layers panel, double click on the color fill thumbnail, and here I'll be able to input the color that I just picked. Now once again, I can hold Alt and simply pick the color that I have here. So it's going to select it. Alternatively, I could have put the hex code of the color that I want here. Every color essentially has a code that represents it. The way I can get the hex code is by double clicking and copying it from here. And then once again, double clicking on the thumbnail and pasting it in. So it essentially picked the same color. Okay, there's the background. The next thing that I'm going to yoink is the logo in the center. It's the AutoHotkey logo. It's an app for Windows. So I'm going to go into my browser and type in AutoHotkey logo PNG. Now the reason I'm looking for a PNG logo is because the PNG file format can sometimes have a transparent background so that I don't have to remove it later in Photoshop. This looks like a similar logo, but red. Ooh, this is pretty much the exact logo. It doesn't look like it's letting me save this image. So what I'll do instead is take a screenshot of it, boink, and then bring in the screenshot into my Photoshop file. So I'll come to my desktop and simply drag it in. Now you'll notice that it created a new layer with my logo. I'm going to double click and name this logo. And when you drag something in, Photoshop will always give you these transform controls so that you can transform your object and place it wherever you want. Remember, you can enter the transform menu with Control T. You'll also notice that when I move the logo around, it snaps to different edges and in the center. If I don't want this to happen, I can hold down Control and it will not snap anywhere. I think on macOS you can do this by holding Option. So I'm going to place this logo in the center. It's going to nicely snap in place. And to commit my changes, I'm going to click Enter. So here I have the logo. You'll also notice this icon over here next to the layer. This is the Smart Object icon. I'm going to have a little hard time explaining what this is, so bear with me. Instead of having this logo, let's have something else. For example, I'm just going to have this red painted circle here. Now the logo looks like a clown. By default, this layer isn't a smart object, which means that if I click Control T to bring up the transform controls and make it super small, then commit my changes, and then Control T once again and resize it back, it now became just a pixel. It's not even round anymore. It's probably better to show this on an image. So now this potato isn't a smart object. And look what happens if I make it super small and then make it super big again. It becomes a potato, but from Minecraft. It loses a bunch of quality. Now I'm going to undo twice, then right click on the potato layer and choose Convert to Smart Object. Now if I size it down to make it super tiny and size it back up again, it doesn't lose any quality. So smart objects are really useful if I want to preserve that layer when I do something with it. Now one more thing I can do is double click on this layer image and it will open it in a new tab. Now I am inside the smart object. So for example, if I paint something here and then close this layer, make sure to click yes to save changes. Now in my original file, this potato has this red painting. And if I size it down and size it back up, it doesn't lose any quality. So you can go inside of the smart object and edit that object, but then in your main file, that object will become non-destructive. You'll also notice that when I pick my brush tool and try to paint on this object, it tells me that I can't. It must first turn this into a normal layer before I can paint on it. So if I click OK, now this is no longer a smart object. And if I size it down and size it back up, it's going to lose quality, but now I can paint here. Okay, so it's useful to have things as smart objects in Photoshop so they don't lose quality. Now I want to remove this normal and this white background from this logo. So I have two options. I can either do it here, which means that I will have to get rid of the smart object, or I can double click inside here and edit only this layer inside the smart object, which I'm going to do. And there are many ways to remove a background. I'll try to show a few methods. The first one is by going into select and choosing subject. This will use Photoshop's fancy AI to detect what's the main subject in my image and try to select it. Let's see if it does a good job. No, it's usually very good at selecting real life objects, not logos. So I'll click Ctrl D to deselect, Command D on Mac. And let's try using this tool, which is the object select tool. I'll select my object and see if it gets it. Oh, it made a great selection. Okay, but let's deselect and I'll show you a few more methods. Under the same tool, if I hold Alt and click, I'll find the quick selection tool with which I can drag and it selects the area that I'm dragging over. I can drag here, and if I accidentally select more, I can hold down Alt, which will turn this from a plus into a minus and deselect the area, like so. So that's another way to select something. Now I want to remove the background, but I have the logo selected. So I want to invert my selection. To do that, I can click Ctrl-Shift-I, Command-Shift-I on macOS, and it will invert the selection. Now you'll see that the background is selected. And the first way to get rid of it is to simply click Delete, which will delete everything that's within the selection. I'm going to undo this. The second way is to use the eraser tool and erase the background, which also works, but there is another way. Let's re-invert the selection back so that I'll have only the logo selected. Ctrl-Shift-I, Command-Shift-I on macOS. And what I can do now is click this icon here, which is the mask icon. Let's see what happens. Boom. It added this second thing to my layer and it cut out the logo. Masks are a big part of Photoshop. It's very important to understand how they work because you're going to use them a lot. So everything that's white reveals and everything that's black hides. In this case, the corners of the mask are black, which means the pixels around this logo are completely hidden. And the inside is completely white, and that's why the entire logo is visible. Now, if I select the mask, not the layer, but the mask, I'll be able to get my brush tool and paint with either black or white. Black hides and white reveals. So if I paint here with black, it's going to hide the logo, and you'll notice that in the mask's preview, that spot also became black. If I want to unhide this, I'm going to switch my foreground and my background color by clicking X on my keyboard. If you click X, it switches between both colors. So I'm going to pick white and paint it back in. Now this area becomes white on the mask and the pixels on this logo reveal themselves. One more thing is if I want to move this layer, the mask moves with it as well. But I can select this icon and now I will move the thing that I have selected. So if I want to move the layer, I can pick it up and you'll notice that the mask doesn't move, but the layer moves. I'm going to undo with Ctrl Z. The same with the mask. If I want to move the mask, I can select it and drag the mask. Cool. I'm going to leave this linked. Click Ctrl S on my keyboard to save this smart object and exit out of it. And there's the logo. Now Photoshop didn't actually do a great job at cutting it out because there's a little bit of white here. So what I'm going to do now is try to fix this. Once again, I'll go inside of the smart object and I'm going to add a dark background so I can see those white pixels. I'll click on this round icon, select solid color, set it to black, and okay. Now it filled everything with black. The reason I don't see the logo is because this color is on top of the logo. So I'll move it down and the logo becomes visible. Now I want to get rid of these white pixels all around the logo. So I'm going to hold Control and click on the layer thumbnail image, which will select the entire logo. And what I'm going to try to do is shrink the entire selection just a little bit, then invert it so that it selects everything else but the logo and delete those pixels. Let's go into Select, Modify, Contract, which will let me contract my selection by some pixels. Let's do 3 pixels. You'll see that the selection will shrink after I click OK. So now some of the logo is outside of the selection, including those white parts. Next, I'll do Ctrl-Shift-I to invert the selection. So now it's selecting the background and those little white parts. Then I'll make sure that I have this layer selected, pick my eraser tool by clicking E on my keyboard and simply erase the edges like this. Now, if I deselect, there are no longer those white edges. This was before and this is after. Cool. If I were to save this smart object now, it's not even going to let me because I added more layers. So I'm going to delete this background and save it now, which will update it in our main document. And now it doesn't have those white edges. I'll click Ctrl T, resize it and put it somewhere in the center, similar to this thumbnail, maybe exactly in the center, something like this. Beautiful. Now I'm also noticing that the edges of this logo are quite uneven. And this doesn't really matter for a thumbnail because people are going to see it this big, but I still want to show you how I would fix that. So actually, I'm just going to disable this logo and re-import another one into Photoshop. And this time, let's do it not inside of a smart object. So to convert it back into a normal layer, the easiest way is to switch to the brush tool, click once and click OK. Now this became a normal layer and not a smart object. So now I'm going to introduce an important concept concept called clipping masks. Let's actually do it on the old layer. Now say I want to paint a shadow on the edge of this logo, but I don't want that shadow to end up on the background, so only on the logo. I'm going to add a new layer, and if I paint with black on the side of this layer, it's also on the background. So what a clipping mask allows you to do is tell Photoshop that you want pixels of one layer to only appear on visible pixels of another layer. The way you can do that is by holding Alt and clicking in between two layers. You can see the little arrow appear. When I click, there's this little arrow appears, and it tells me that this layer only applies to the bottom layer. So now the shadow is only on the logo, but it doesn't touch the background. And if I paint with any other color like white, it will only appear on the layer that's beneath. If I want to remove this clipping mask, I can hold Alt again and click in between two layers, which will unclip it. And now you can see my actual white painting. So this is how clipping masks work. And I'm going to use it to crop out this logo. In this case, this logo is going to be the thing that I'm clipping. So if I add a layer underneath and do something like this, and then clip the logo, it's going to clip it to this white blob underneath, to whatever I painted here. So essentially, I want to make a shape that's the same as this logo. For that, I'm going to use the rectangle tool and create a rectangle like this. Next, I'm going to decrease the opacity of this rectangle so that I can see the logo underneath. And here in the corners, I can pick this corner and round it like this. Essentially, I want to make this shape the exact same size as my logo. So something like this. If those corners disappear, I can always click back on my rectangle tool and they appear again. So I can drag this to match the corners. And to move the rectangle around, I'm picking my move tool. So I'm just going to match it to the logo. This looks... Actually, I'm going to delete the rectangle and show you another cool trick. When you start drawing something, whether it's a selection or a shape, and you start in the wrong place, you can hold down space bar to move it around. So now I'm holding space and moving this into place. Then I release space and I can continue drawing out the rectangle. Now I matched it with my logo, so I'm going to release it, decrease the opacity a bit so I can see the logo underneath and move in these corners like so. Cool. So now I have this shape on top. I'll increase the opacity back to 100. And now I want to clip my auto hotkey logo onto this shape. So hold Alt and click in between two layers and the background disappeared. Now the cool thing here is that this now becomes adjustable. I can always come to this rectangle and it will adjust the area that this top layer is clipping into. For example, Control T to transform, and if I make the rectangle smaller, the top layer is still clipped to it. So if I commit the changes, it ends up looking like this. So changing this area changes what this clips onto. If I mask out or delete some of the rectangle, the logo will no longer show on those parts. Now it's only showing on this area because I hid that part of the rectangle. I'm going to delete the mask, yes. And at the bottom here, I'm still seeing a little bit of white. So I'll click on the rectangle and try to adjust it so the white is no longer visible. Beautiful. Next, I'm going to be resizing this logo. So I'm going to select both of these layers. You can do that by clicking on one layer, then holding Shift and clicking another one. This will also select any other layer that's in between. If you want to select individual layers, you can hold Control instead of Shift or Command on Mac, and it will let you select individual layers. So I'm going to select both of these, right click and choose Convert to Smart Object. Now this became as one layer that I'm going to name Logo, and I can freely size it down and size it back up again without it losing quality. Since I've made some progress, I want to save this file. So I'll click Control S to save and save it as Thumbnail Recreation. Boom. One more cool thing about Photoshop is if you delete the files that you imported into a Photoshop project, they don't disappear from the project. So if I delete this potato and open the potato PSD file, it still has the potato image inside. So once you import images, you can safely delete them. You don't have to keep them next to your project files. Next, you'll notice that the logo in my original thumbnail has a slight shadow. So let's learn how to add that in. Of course, there are a couple ways, but the easiest one is to double click on the side of the layer where there's empty space. This will bring up the layer style options for this specific layer. And inside of these layer style options, you can add a bunch of stuff. For example, a stroke, which added this black outline to the logo. If I want to edit how it looks like, I have to select the stroke, and here I can change the color. For example, make it white, change the thickness of it. Maybe I want to add another stroke. I can click this plus, which will add another one. I'll increase its size and change the color to red, for example, and it added a second outline on top of the first one. But I don't want this, so I'll click the trash icon for each of them, which will get rid of the strokes. And what I want is drop shadow. I'm going to enable it and click inside of here to edit the shadow. First things first, it will always remember the settings that you used previously. So I'm going to change these, make the opacity or the visibility of the shadow 100. Now you can't really see the shadow because it's under the logo. So what I can also do is pick up the shadow with my mouse and move it around however I want. Notice that when I'm moving the shadow, the values on the right change. So it's changing the distance and the angle of the shadow. Now the spread is going to make the shadow spread more, and the size is going to increase its size. So I'll move the shadow here and increase its size slightly to make it look like this. I'll also slightly decrease how visible the shadow is to try to match this shadow that's already on this logo. So now this shadow here and the shadow on the logo itself is quite similar, which is a nice touch. Okay, to commit the changes, I'll click OK. And now you'll see that under my logo, it shows that some effects have been applied, and those effects are drop shadow. So I have two options: either hide all of the effects, which in this case is only drop shadow, but I can have multiple effects like the stroke, or I can only hide and show the drop shadow if I want. Very cool. Next, let's do these icons. They have text underneath, then this notepad logo, and a different icon for each of them. The text as well as the icon has a drop shadow, and there's also a slight drop shadow behind each logo. So let's try to recreate those. For this, again, I'm going to go into my browser and look for a Windows notepad logo, preferably PNG so it doesn't have a background. These don't look like the logo I'm looking for, so let's do icon instead of logo. Maybe TXT file icon? Yes, let's use this one. I'm going to right click, copy image, go back into Photoshop and paste it in. And once again, I want to remove the background from this image, but first I'll convert it into a smart object so that it doesn't ruin when I resize it. Next, I'll go into the smart object and try to remove the background here. This time I'm going to do it with the magnetic lasso tool, since this notepad has sharp corners, which is perfect for this tool. I'm going to go around it and select it like this. Boink, Control 0 to make it full screen, and I'm going to click on the mask icon to mask it out. So now the background is black, which means that those pixels that are black are hidden in this layer, which is the entire background of the layer. And the stuff that's white in the mask shows. So that's why the notepad logo is visible. One more thing I can do is hold Alt and click on the mask icon to see only the mask. So I can preview it if I want. I can hold Alt again and click on the mask to see the actual layer. Another thing I can do is right click and temporarily disable the mask to maybe see how the layer looks without the mask. Okay, I'll click Ctrl S to save and go back here, which now gives us this notepad without the background. I'll click Ctrl T to resize it, size it down slightly and move it like this. One more useful thing is that you can duplicate a layer by holding Alt and clicking on that layer. This created a copy of this layer. The same inside of the layers panel. If I hold Alt, it's going to duplicate the layer. And now I can pick it up and drag it somewhere else. The same with layer effects. I can hold Alt and duplicate the layer effects onto a different layer. So now this notepad logo has a subtle shadow because I copied the shadow effect from this center logo. I'm going to duplicate this one more time, and instead of adding an effect to each individual layer, I'm going to select all of these notepad layers and click Ctrl G on my keyboard, which will create a group. I'm going to double click and name this group notepads. Now all of these layers are inside this one group, and what I can do is come here to these effects, hold Alt and drag this effect onto the entire group, which now applied this drop shadow to every single layer that's inside the group. So I don't have to do this with each layer individually. I can apply effects to a group, and every single layer inside that group will inherit those effects. Very cool. Let me double check how these are laid out. This one's straight, this one's tilted to the right, and tilted to the left. So I'm going to come here, click on this layer with my move tool, which will automatically select that layer inside my layers panel. I'm going to move this panel group inside the layers panel group so that I can see layers across the entire screen. Just like in many Adobe apps, you can arrange panels inside the app however you want. So I can drag my tools over here or over here to the left. Maybe I want the channels panel to be here. I can put it here if I want. Maybe I don't want it entirely. I can close it. If you close a panel that you didn't want to close, you can always go into Window and select the panel that you just closed, which will open it. So if I want my notes panel, I can click on it and it will appear. If I don't want it, I can close it. Okay, so I'm going to click on this layer, which will select the layer inside of my layers panel, click Ctrl T to transform and rotate it like so. The same for all of these notepad logos. Cool. Next, I'm going to need the text underneath. So this one says run. For text, I'll click T to bring up the text tool and simply click somewhere to start typing in text. Run.txt. I want the text to be white, so I'll select all of it, and here in the color, I'll pick white. Then I think I chose the font for this text to be the same font as Windows has, and at the top, I can see that it's this font. So I'm going to copy this, double click on the text layer, and it seems like it already selected the font that I used previously. So I'm going to click Ctrl T to transform this text layer, and I'm going to make it slightly bigger like this and position it below the notepad. Enter. Now, since this text is inside of this group, it's also getting the drop shadow effect. If I remove this layer from the group, the shadow from the text disappears. Maybe it's going to be more visible when I put it back in the group. Anyway, just wanted to highlight that. Next, I'll hold Alt and click and drag on this text to duplicate it. And then I'm going to say system.txt. Control T to transform and make sure that the text fits here. I think I made these notepad icons a little too large. So what I can do is select the entire group, click Control T, which will let me transform the entire group collectively. So now I can drag on the corner to make the icons slightly smaller like this. If I want, I can select both of these by holding Shift and clicking, then Control T and transform them together. So next I'll just make sure the text looks good. Now, for some reason, I want my text to have a slightly different shadow because this type of shadow is not really visible. So I'm going to hold Shift and select all of my text layers and move them outside the group. And then I'll click Control G to create a second group for my text. Text under logos. Next, I'll double click here to bring up the layer style panel and add a different drop shadow. I'll make sure to select the drop shadow so that I can change its values. And I'll increase the opacity, I think, maybe the size slightly, maybe the distance, and then decrease the opacity. Something like this. So before, after, and okay to commit the changes. Cool. Now all that's left with these files are these icons on top of the files. Those are pretty easy. So let's find those. First one is a Windows mouse icon. Let's do something like this. Copy image and paste it in. Now there are many different ways to select this, but for this, let's try the object selection tool and drag it outside of the object. Ooh, that's horrible. I'll deselect with Control D and let's instead try the quick selection tool. Maybe this works slightly better. I'm going to make the brush smaller. Once again, by holding Alt and clicking and dragging with my right mouse button. I'll select each of these like so. Beautiful. And to remove the background, I'll click the mask icon. Nice. Next, I'll right click and convert this into a small object because I'll be resizing this mouse cursor and I'm going to size it down to be like this. Now it seems like I've missed 1 pixel there. So I'll go inside of the smart object and paint with color white to reveal this area. Now I want to make sure that I'm not painting on the actual layer, but I'm painting on the mask because I want to make that little pixel of the mask white so that it shows the layer that's underneath. So I'm going to paint here with white, which will reveal the pixel on the mouse cursor. Control S to save. Next, I'll need the hand cursor, and this one looks good. I'll copy it, paste it in, and this time the image is very large compared to my document. So I'll right click, and since I want to resize it, click Convert to Smart Object, then Control T and resize it like so. Next, I'll go inside here and try to remove the background. Let's do the same method as before with the quick selection tool. Beautiful. I have the mouse selected and I'll click the mask icon to mask it out. Control S to save the smart object and Control W to close this tab. Control T to transform this, make it smaller and put it on this TXT file. Something like this. Beautiful. Next, I need the system info logo and the blocking logo. I'll find those. This time, since the logo is round, I'm going to select it with the elliptical marquee tool. It essentially lets me draw a circle. I can hold Shift and it's going to make a perfect circle. Remember, if I want to move the selection, I can also hold space and move it around. So now I'm holding Shift to make the circle perfect and space at the same time to move it around. The same thing I did before, click the mask icon and it's masked out. Then right click and convert to Smart Object. This logo has a black background and the inside of it isn't filled with white. So I have a couple options to turn it into a logo that looks like this. First, I can fill these black spots with the bucket tool that's underneath the gradient tool. I'll make sure I have my color set to white and click here and it will figure out that it needs to paint this with white. The same on the other side. And to select this, again, I'm going to use this tool and select it like so. Boink. Beautiful. So these 4 layers are the icons, which I'm going to group as well with Control G icons. And once again, I want to apply a subtle drop shadow on each of the logos. So instead of doing it one by one on each of these layers, I can apply the shadow on the entire group by double clicking here and choosing drop shadow. This time I want the shadow to be subtle, so I'll decrease its opacity and maybe slightly increase the size like this. Beautiful. There are 2 more things left. First, there's this vignette around the corners of this thumbnail, actually around only the background, and this this logo in the center has a more saturated green color compared to this logo. So first, let's do the vignette. Once again, there are many different ways to do this in Photoshop, but what I'm going to do is convert this color layer that adds the background color into a smart object, and then I'm going to go into filter and choose camera raw filter. Now, camera raw filter is essentially like Adobe Lightroom. It has a bunch of different things that Lightroom has. So if you've ever used Lightroom, you're going to feel right at home. This camera raw panel is especially useful when you have edited your entire image and you want to add final color adjustments. One more useful keyboard shortcut is if you want to combine all the visible layers into a separate layer, you can click Ctrl-Shift-Alt-E on your keyboard or Command-Option-Shift-E on Mac. This will create a separate layer out of all the visible layers underneath of it. So now this is just one layer. I can't select and move these objects automatically. The reason I'm mentioning this is usually when you edit a picture in full, you want to apply the camera raw filter to the whole image, not to individual parts like I'm doing here for the background. You want the color adjustments to apply to everything. So the way you can do that is combine everything into one layer, then right click and convert it to a smart object, and then apply the camera raw filter on top of everything. So now if I increase the exposure, it's going to increase it for the entire image, not only the background. And the reason I converted this into a smart object is because now I have this camera raw filter saved as a filter that I can double click and edit later. So you can see the exposure is increased here, and I can maybe change my mind and dial it down a bit. If this wasn't a smart object, so I'm going to undo everything. Now it's not a smart object, and if I go to filter, camera raw filter, and make some adjustments here, like increase exposure, then if I click OK, I can't double click into filters and change this later. The only way I can get this layer back is by pressing Ctrl-Z on my keyboard to undo. But once again, if I do a bunch of other things, then I would have to undo a bunch of other things to get to this layer, which would undo the camera raw filter. So always convert things into smart objects. I will make every layer visible again. I can click and drag across the eyes to make everything visible, then select the background and go to filter, camera raw filter. Now I want to apply a vignette to this background. So scroll down till I find vignette. It's under optics, and I'm going to decrease the vignette to make it darker. If you increase it, it will make the corners brighter. So I'll do something like this, and I'll even make the midpoint slightly lower so that the vignette goes towards the center. Now when I click OK, there's the vignette. If I want, I can disable and enable it here. Cool. So now if someone looks at this thumbnail, their eyes get focused to the center, which is the main thing that I want the viewer to firstly notice, and that's the logo of the app that the video is about. Next, I'll do the same for the logo. I'm going to click on it, go to filter, camera raw filter, and this time I want to slightly increase the saturation. So I'll find my saturation slider and slide it to the right, which will make the green slightly more green. If I want to see the before and after, I can click this icon here and it will show me before, after, before, after. So you can see that the green became more green. Beautiful. And I think I have successfully recreated this thumbnail. Original, new, original, new. Maybe let's make the green even more saturated. I'll double click on the camera raw filter and increase the saturation slider even more. Boink, new, original, new, original. Beautiful. Now to export this, I can go into File, Export, and Export As, or click the keyboard shortcut, Alt, Shift, Control, W. This will bring up the same Export As panel. Here I have a bunch of options for how I want to export this image. Firstly, I can choose the format, PNG, JPEG, or GIF. I'll stick with PNG. Then I can choose to resize my image. For example, if I want to make it double the size, I can say ×2, enter, and it will double the size of the image. Of course, Photoshop will use some scaling method to double the size, so the image will always look best at the original size that it was at. I don't want to change anything here except make sure that convert to sRGB is selected. If I'm uploading this to the internet, this is a thumbnail, so I'm going to be uploading this to YouTube, and once I'm happy with the result, I'll click export. Here I can pick the name and click save. Beautiful. If I go into my desktop, here is my thumbnail, perfectly recreated in Photoshop. I hope that this video was helpful or interesting in some way, and if you want to learn how to use Adobe Premiere Pro to edit videos in a similar amount of time, then you can watch this tutorial here. It follows a very similar structure where I try to edit a simple video from start to finish while explaining how to do it. If you like this tutorial, then you'll definitely like that one. Oh, and there's one more thing I totally forgot to mention. Psych.